So hello guys, Alex here, and welcome to what will be our final video of the Italian game Classical Variation. What we're going to be discussing is the Giuoco Pianissimo, which in Italian means the very quiet game. It arises after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and the move d3. It can also arise via a different move order, pawn to c3 first, and only after knight f6, playing now pawn to d3. We will look at it from the conventional move order of pawn to d3, and now after knight f6, pawn to c3. What I want to say before we discuss specific variations is that this is what is being played at the highest levels the most, and one of the big reasons for it is because it's more flexible. Versus the positions where white pushes his pawn to d4, there are more possibilities for either side. For professional chess players, this means that they're able to forget opening theory to some extent and have more chances of outplaying their opponents by demonstrating superior chess understanding in the middle game and the end game. For us, from an opening theory perspective, this presents a difficulty. There are simply too many lines and too many options to be able to cover everything in one video. Moreover, because this is the position that is most frequently being arrived at in the classical variation of the Italian game today at the highest level, there are some of the greatest chess minds in the world are constantly trying to come up with new, subtle ideas and variations to introduce into tournament play and surprise their opponents. In other words, the theory is constantly developing. Therefore, what we will do in this video is we will show the key concepts and also we will show some of the critical lines. We will not cover every line, but hopefully between a discussion of the typical motifs, maneuvers, and concepts, coupled with a brief examination of the major lines, you will walk away with an ability to play the Giuoco Pianissimo better, whether it is from the white side or from the black side. So let's dive into the main possibilities here. Black, in this position, after white's move pawn to c3, has three major options. These are pawn to d6, pawn to a6, or kingside castling. The moves pawn to d6 and pawn to a6 will tend to lead to quite similar positions. Pawn to d6 we will look at as our main line, but first, let's briefly look at pawn to a6. Pawn to a6 is a useful move because the bishop on c5 often drops back to a7. On a7, it still remains on the long diagonal, but the benefit is that it's less susceptible to being attacked by either pawn to b4 or, more likely, pawn to d4, with a strike both on e5 and c5. After a6, white will typically castle, black will now play bishop to a7, white will drop the bishop back to b3 most often, and here black will play d6 supporting the center. And this is the final move that we will consider in the a6 variation. The reason why it's the final move is because this position is likely to be arrived at via our mainline move order, which involves first playing on move 5 d6 and only later on, perhaps on move 7 or 8, playing the move pawn to a6. So before we dive into the details of pawn to d6, I want to go back to the original position and I want to show you the interesting alternative to either d6 or a6, and that is the increasingly popular move, Kingside Castle. The key option that black gives himself with this move order is the possibility of advancing the d-pawn not just to d6, but in fact to d5 directly. This is concrete, direct, aggressive chess, and the truth is that white to this day is struggling to find an antidote against this aggressive approach from black. The benefits of playing the pawn to d5 directly is that it attacks both e4 and c4, and it collects a little bit more space in the center. The major drawback is that after pawn takes d5 and knight takes d5, in such positions as these, we see that the black position will be a little bit less stable. What I mean by this is that the knight on d5 is attacked once and defended once, and the pawn on e5 is attacked once and defended once, while the bishop on c5 is undefended. We can see that there is a lot more instability than if black instead chooses the calmer pawn to d6. Here we have the knight on f6 instead of d5, where it is much more stable, and the pawn on d6 supports the bishop on c5, which is no longer undefended, and overprotects the pawn on e5, which is now defended twice rather than only once. However, concrete analysis from the black side, with the help of computers, has shown that black can get away with this very ambitious move. So let's take a look at the specifics. After the move castle, white here has several options. The main line that we will look at is Kingside Castle. But before we do that, let's look at the two other options, knight b to d2 and bishop to b3. Let's look at knight b to d2 first. The idea here is that after black puts the pawn on d5, white will capture on d5, knight takes d5, and now, because white spent his tempo playing knight d2 instead of castle, white can bring the knight to e4 immediately and attack the bishop on c5. However, this is not a big deal from a black perspective, because first of all, the main move, bishop e7, is perfectly good. And second of all, I want to show you guys a game played between Vishy Anand, the top Indian chess player and former world champion, and Vladimir Kramnik, also a former world champion and one of the greatest chess players of all time. This game was played in 2018, and it continued with bishop to b6. Anand played Kingside Castle. Kramnik developed the bishop to g4, creating an uncomfortable pin on the knight on f3. Anand kicked the bishop away. Black played the bishop back to h5, and knight g3 was played to break this uncomfortable pin. Black dropped the bishop back to g6, and white tried to exploit the instability of the pawn on e5 by attacking it with rook e1. Black simply defended, rook e8, and now white played pawn to d4. This is a useful and thematic idea to be aware of. The point is, although black could take here on d4, this would be a blunder. After rook takes e8, queen takes e8, bishop takes d5, we see that the queen is no longer defending the knight, and so black would lose a piece. Therefore, in this position, black must find an alternative move. Luckily, he can also play off of white's problems with this rook that is not only putting pressure on e5, but is also defending the queen. Kramnik played the move knight f6. Now, after knight f6, white took on e5, and black captured queen takes queen intermezzo, rook takes queen, and now we see that the rook is no longer defending the e5 pawn, so knight takes e5 can be played. Knight takes e5 was played by Anand, and with this move, Vishy Anand with the white pieces offered a draw. And I wanted to show you guys this game because for me, it's a great illustration of the problems that white is having in the main line of the Giuoco Pianissimo to actually get an advantage. We can see that it's quite easy for white to obtain equality, but it's very, very difficult to get anything more than that. And here we can see that after only 16 moves, Anand had given up trying to get an advantage and offered a draw. Let's return now to the original position. We just saw what happens after the move knight b to d2. What if instead white drops the bishop back to b3, anticipating the pawn push to d5? Now the idea behind this is that after d5, because there's no attack on the bishop, white can use his move to, rather than take the black pawn, to instead support his own pawn on e4 with queen to e2. Here, however, black gets a great game in a variety of ways. One of the most active white pieces that we notice is this bishop on b3. So a great move is pawn to a5. This threatens to push the bishop back to a more passive square. After a5, white typically continues with bishop to g5. Now, black should capture on e4, take on e4, and here simply challenge the white bishop. The white bishop drops back to h4, and finally black pushes his a-pawn to a4. The bishop can try to stay on the long diagonal. This is likely the best move. But after queen d6, a move which makes a lot of sense because, for starters, it protects e5, and as a result of this, it allows this knight to move away from the defense of e5 and shift over to the king side, a typical knight maneuver in the Italian game. Besides this, the queen move also breaks the pin. Black here has at least an equal position, so I don't recommend this queen e2 idea. Let's go back to the original position. Having examined both bishop b3 and knight b to d2, we will now look at the main option for white of Kingside Castle. Here, black can continue with d5, and after e takes d5, knight takes d5. After knight takes d5, this position is one of the critical positions of the line for black, but after the main moves of rook to e1, attacking the pawn on e5, black has a clever way of defending the pawn. He cannot play the move bishop to d6, since the knight on d5 would fall, but what he can do is he can pin the knight on g4. After pawn to h3, he does not want to capture this knight, because this would surrender a very important piece, and the white queen would be in a very good square. And here, with the two bishops, white has an advantage. However, he can simply maintain the pin, and it is too dangerous for white to play g4, bishop g6, and then capture the pawn. It's true that in this situation, white would end up with an extra pawn, but the position would be a little bit similar to the well-respected Marshall defense, only in this case, the position would be even an improved version over the Marshall after moves like knight takes e5, rook takes e5, and pawn to c6. I should say that the Marshall defense is not something that we are covering in this series. It's an opening that arises out of not the Italian game, but instead the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. But feel free to check that out if you would like to know more about the Marshall defense. For now, let's return to the original position. Here, white, instead of pawn to g4, should not try and take the pawn, and rather play knight b to d2. Now, black will play knight to b6, striking at the bishop on c4. Full disclosure, white has had quite good results in recent times with the move b4 at the highest levels of chess. The lines there are quite complicated, so we're not going to discuss them in this particular video. For now, we will just talk about the traditional main line, which is the move bishop to b5. And here, after white attacks the knight on c6, his idea is to undermine the weak center. Remember how at the start of these variations, we talked about how by playing d5, black plays very aggressive chess, but he also risks that the pawn on e5 will be unstable and vulnerable. Black here will drop the bishop to d6, and it is not in the interest of white to capture this knight because this bishop is quite strong for now. Instead, white continues knight to e4, centralizing his knight, and black here can continue with either the move pawn to f5 or the move rook to e8. At the master level, these positions can form so much analysis that it could take up an entire book. But for now, for our sake, we will say that this position is approximately equal and very, very rich in possibilities for either side. If you are going to play these positions regularly from the white or the black side at a higher level, it's a great starting point to do further investigation by yourself. Let's return to the other variations now. We have just finished discussing the move Kingside Castle, and now we are going to talk about the main move, the more conventional and safe approach from black, which is pawn to d6. After this, white typically will castle, pawn to a6, and here white has a few different options. The only other one besides the main line that we are going to look at is the move pawn to a4, grabbing space on the queen side. One of the ideas behind it is that now the rook supports the a3 square, and the knight will maneuver from b1 to a3 and then to c2. This makes sense because of the fact that the pawn being on c3 prevents the knight from going to c3. So the knight on b1 is limited to two options, either go to d2 or go to a3. And these indeed form two of the key plans in the Giuoco Pianissimo. The main option is to bring the knight to d2, and from here typically go to f1 after the rook clears, and from there go to either g3 or e3. But in the lines of a4, we see this alternative plan, knight a3, and from here it can go either to c2, from which it can go to e3, or it can go to c4 if the bishop moves. So white plays with all of these different possibilities. One line we can look at is a4, bishop a7, knight a3, black castles kingside, knight to c2, and now black improves the placement of his own knight. Notice that with the pawn on c3, white controls the forward jumps of the black knight, so the knight on c6 is not so well placed. So knight to e7, and white now plays bishop e3, fighting against black's best piece, the bishop on the long diagonal. After bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, we reach a position that two of the best players in the world, Magnus Carlsen and Vishy Anand, arrived at both times in 2016. And funnily enough, on one occasion, Carlsen had the white pieces, and on the other occasion, it was Anand that had the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen, the current world #1 chess player, in fact won both games. And I think that this tells you everything you need to know about the evaluation of these positions. In fact, they are just objectively equal, and the game will be decided by who plays the middle game and endgame stages better on the day. Just one final detail from this position. I can say that Anand as black chose the move knight to g6, while Carlsen as black chose to expand on the queen side with the move pawn to a5. Both of them are perfectly playable moves. Let's return to the original position before we played a4. The main move instead by white is to play bishop to b3. Dropping the bishop back is a typical and useful move where the bishop from b3 will stay on the long diagonal, but it will be less vulnerable to attacks like b5, d5, or knight a5. After bishop b3, black does similarly and places his bishop back on a7. From here, black does not have to worry about the possibility of an advance d4, which would strike not only at the center, but would also leave the black bishop under attack. White here typically plays knight b to d2. He might start with the move rook e1, but often these moves will transpose into the same position. After knight b d2, black castles, and now white takes control of the important g4 square. We already saw in some variations the usefulness for black of placing the bishop on g4, pinning the white knight to the queen. So after h3, black can do similarly and play h6, since white may also play bishop g5 or even knight g5 at the right moment. White now plays rook to e1, supporting the e4 pawn and also preparing this maneuver we spoke about previously. The queen's knight, we spoke about two maneuvers, knight a3 to c2 or knight d2 to f1. So we see that white prepares this latter maneuver. After rook e1, one important thing about this position is we see that although there are many similarities, there are some key differences. One of the key differences is that white has put his pawn on c3, whereas black has his knight on c6. This is really important to understand the effect it has on the position, because it allows black to formulate a plan of attack against the f4 square. Black's most popular move here is knight to h5, eyeing up the f4 square. However, this would not be as effective for white to play. If white on the previous move had played knight h4 to try and land the knight to f5, we see that the square, the f5 square, is controlled by black. On top of this, if black played knight e7, he could further control the f5 square. So this strategy is not very effective from a white perspective. However, from a black perspective, it makes sense because the white knight is on d2 rather than the equivalent c3. And the effect of this is twofold. The first effect is that the bishop is blocked from covering the f4 square. And the second effect is that unlike this equivalent knight, which can go to c6 and cover the f5 square, the white knight is on d2, and from there it cannot go to e2 like it could if it were on c3, so it cannot cover the f4 square so easily. This last point that I made about the battle for the f4 and f5 squares is a challenging point to understand. So I would recommend that you go back and re-watch the material or investigate the position independently until you're clear of the effect of these asymmetries in the position on the different plans that each side should follow. For now, let's go back to discussing knight to h5. So after black's move knight to h5, here white typically goes knight to f1. Now, I want to point out that the knight on h5 is x-rayed by the queen, and so it's very tempting to take on e5. If pawn takes knight, then queen takes knight, and white would be up a pawn for now. However, what we notice is that after knight takes knight, the pawn on d3 would fall in the end of the variation. So queen takes h5, knight takes d3, with a double attack on the rook and the pawn. So this is not a good idea for white, and this is why after knight h5, white does not go for the capture on e5. Instead, he plays knight to f1, and now black does not want to put his knight on f4 immediately, because after bishop takes f4, pawn takes f4, white could play d4, taking over the center and leaving black with a very bad bishop on a7. Instead, black plays queen f6, further controlling f4 and now preparing knight f4. White typically continues with bishop to e3, and here I recommend the simple move bishop takes e3. Now, white has a couple of options. If he wants to keep the game alive, he will capture on e3 with the pawn, improving his control of the center and preventing the black knight from jumping onto its intended target of f4. As a result, black's pieces are a little bit silly in their placement, and the difference in the structure and the creation of a semi-open file on the f-file makes the position more double-edged and gives chances for both sides. However, in tournament practice, most of the time, the white player doesn't like to take that risk and instead plays knight takes e3. So if you are playing this position from the white side, the choice of whether to take with the knight or with the pawn is really all about how much risk you want to take and perhaps how much better or worse you are on paper than your opponent. If you're happy with a draw against your opponent, knight takes e3 is a great choice. If you'd like to play for a win and are happier to accept a greater chance of losing, then f takes e3 is the way to go. Knight takes e3 in practice is the main line, and all you need to know about this position, about the evaluation of it, is that 80% of master level games from this position have ended in a draw after the move knight f4. And when you see so many games at the highest level in chess ending in a draw from this position, you can be pretty confident that the position is equal. So here we will leave our analysis of the Giuoco Pianissimo. It absolutely is not a complete analysis of what is, in effect, the absolute main line in modern chess in the Italian game classical variation today at the highest level. But in order to cover every line, we would have to dedicate not just half an hour or 1 hour to the material, but probably no less than 100 hours. For sure, we will not do this. And so hopefully the concepts and the specific variations that you saw today have served as a great starting point. And at the club level, it will be almost certainly more information than your opponents will have and will give you a great chance to fight for an advantage both from the white side or indeed from the black side. This concludes our series on the Italian game classical variation. In the future, we will cover the two knights defense of the Italian and other rare third move options. But for now, we will conclude this section of the Italian game. I've been International Master Alex Astaneh with Chessfactor.com. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I will see you in another video soon.